Good afternoon, everybody. Megan's just been here helping me, and between the both of us, we may have this fixed so that it's right. I don't know. It's a beautiful day today. I hope it is where you are. As far as I know, everybody in the family is okay. Jim and I are both working today. Which it doesn't always happen. It seems that when I'm at home, he's working and vice versa. But anyway, I was reading Southern Living magazine, and I saw all these pictures of beautiful homes. If you've read the Southern Living magazine, you know that they frequently show beautiful homes, always in the South, of course. We had an article in Southern Living one time about Burke's Garden, so the readers do actually, many of them anyway, do actually know who we are. I'm going to see if I can get a little bit more light. Maybe that might be a little bit better. Anyway, I decided that I would look a little bit more closely into fashions, home furnishings, and the outside of homes and so on back a long time ago, in the period of time that we talk about a lot, before the Civil War, mostly. And I just found out all kinds of good things that I really didn't know about how things were in those days. Some of those houses, and some in Tazewell County, were built in like 1828, 1830, 1833, and some of them are still standing. There's at least 2 in Burke's Garden. And there's several in Tazewell County that are still standing from that era. I haven't been in any of them, so I don't really know about the furnishings or anything like that. But every time I start researching something like that, I learn so much more than I'm able to tell you about. Those of you who have been in Bluefield, Virginia, or lived in Bluefield, Virginia, remember Chicago House Furnishing Company. It was right across from the drugstore on the corner there. It took up a whole block. I think we've maybe talked about it a little bit more. And they had the most gorgeous furniture. They really did. They had beautiful stuff. And you know now, there's only one furniture store in this town, in these 2 towns, in both Bluefields. There's Camera Furniture Company. There's also Bluestone Bedding in this town, in Bluefield, Virginia. But at one time, there were all kinds of furniture stores in both the Bluefields. And I loved Chicago House Furnishing Company. It was so big, and it was one of the first stores that I was ever in where they set up rooms. You know, if they were selling a bedroom set, they had it in a setting so that there would be the whole thing, and there'd be curtains and rugs and the whole thing. And I remember that very well, and how much I liked going there. And I'm sorry that we don't have those kind of furniture stores anymore. But you know, from what I'm hearing, people are buying online. One of the ladies that I work with here told me today she just bought a new car. Do you know how she bought it? Online. Oh my goodness. I always love to go to the car lots and smell the new car smell, because we never did buy a lot of new cars. We bought cars that were new to us, but as well as I can remember, we only ever bought 2 cars that were absolutely new, right off the showroom floor. And all the rest of the time, we bought used cars, hoping to get them from 10 to 20,000 miles on them. And we always had real good luck with that. I don't know how I started talking about cars, because back in 1850 there weren't any. Now were there? Well, and that's what the fashions that I had seen in Southern living. I am very glad that I didn't live in that time period. I'm not I don't really care for hard work that much, I think. I remember when my mother, I was born in 34, so this had to be 40, maybe when I can remember, was washing on a board, on a washboard, which is now hanging in my daughter's bathroom upstairs. And that's the way I learned to wash. Get the water out of the rain barrel or carry it from somewhere and heat it up, and that's the way I learned. And then she got a wringer washer, which was a very wonderful thing. But anyway, when you look at the elaborate window treatments that people of wealth had in their houses in that time period, it astonishes you. There were only the wealthy could afford the velvets and tapestries and so on that were the top, what they call the top curtains in that day, and the carpets that went on the floor. They had other things, though. I'll tell you some words that I learned that I didn't know before while I was looking this up. If you lived in the country, or if you didn't have a lot of money, which most people didn't, I believe it said in one article that I read that 90-some% of the citizens in that time period didn't live in towns. They lived out in the country, or whatever you want to call it. And that really is a short time ago for that to be true. But even, of course, during the Civil War, it was still true that there were more people who lived in rural areas than lived in towns or cities. Where I lived, where I grew up, of course, I had a lot of relatives around. My one set of grandparents lived almost within shouting distance from me. The land that Daddy built their house on had been his and Granny's, and he gave all of his land to his 3 sons. And they still live there. And I had 2 uncles that lived on that ridge. I had one aunt, mother's sister, and her husband that lived on that ridge. And then a lot of the other people who lived there were related to me as well. But do you know now, that's not true. My brother still lives there. My brother named Roger, who's the 4th child in the family. He still lives there on the property that was Uncle Elmer's in the beginning. It was Grandpaps, and then it was Uncle Elmer's, and he sold it to Roger. But people didn't mind walking. It didn't seem like, to get back and forth from each other's houses. But the first thing that I can remember on our windows was muslin. I'm sure Mother sewed them. And then I remember when plastic came along, she had plastic curtains on the windows. Of course, she also said that if people wouldn't make fun of her, she wouldn't even have window coverings. We lived, of course, way out. There wasn't anybody close to us that could see through the windows. But she said, I wouldn't put curtains on the windows. It's too beautiful to be able to look outside and see the birds and the flowers and the trees and the sky and the animals. I wouldn't even put curtains on, but I'm afraid people will talk about me. Oh, how many times I've heard that. Now, I'm going to go back to my notes, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the indoor furnishings for houses that were built and occupied from about 1830 to about 1850. And here's that note that I told you about. At the time, more than 90% of Americans lived in rural areas, and wealth dictated how your house was decorated. Only the wealthy could afford lighting and plumbing. And of course, lighting would have been gas lighting. And I'm not sure exactly when people started putting plumbing in their, actually put water in their homes and had indoor plumbing. I'm really not sure about that. But we didn't have that at our house until I was gone away from home and married and had a home of my own. I remember reading about people whitewashing their walls. There was not sheetrock. The walls in the house that Daddy built for Mother in 1933, it had wallpaper on the board. He didn't put sheetrock up. I don't guess it was available because he did put it up later. But they had wallpaper on it, and they had, and you had these little things these little pieces of cardboard that were about like that, and you put those on under the nail head so that it wouldn't go through the wallpaper. Wallpaper wasn't all that pretty, but it was a protection against the cold and the wind. Oh, I remember that very well. But if you lived in that time period and you could afford it, you would have carpets. They weren't the carpets like we see today, of course. There was something called, they made floor cloths before there were carpets. They made floor cloths. And there was a fabric called Drugget, D-R-U-G-G-E-T. I wanted to be sure and tell you about that. It was a floor covering. And that's what they put down on the floors instead of carpet. And it talked about not having padding or anything, and that you took paper, not cardboard, because that would make the floor covering bumpy. But you put like sheets of paper, or maybe something like butcher paper if they had it, I don't know. And that's what you covered up the cracks in the floor with. Then you put your floor covering down. I can remember when there were cracks in our floors, but then they put linoleum down. And I also read when I was looking at this about how you could make your own oilcloth. Does anybody out there know what oilcloth is? That's what we had on our table. Daddy built a table that all of us could sit around. It had a bench behind it and chairs in front of it and at the end. And sometimes there'd be several layers of oilcloth on that, because you used it until the finish began to come off, and then you covered it up with another one. Now later on, Daddy built another table that had, it was built out of wood, and it was finished, and you didn't have to put oilcloth on it, and that's what's still at Mother's house, as far as I know. But people lived entirely different lives back in before the Civil War and after. I used to think that the Victorian era was just right after the Civil War, but it wasn't. It didn't happen until 1870 to 1890. In that time period was the Victorian period, and that's when the Sanders house was built, You know, if you've been there, how beautiful it is. And if you haven't, you ought to go when you get a chance. The furnishings in that house were really, really nice compared to the furnishings that other people in this town and county had, I'm sure. But they were wealthy farmers and could afford to have that kind of furniture. And I found another word I wanted to talk to you about. Can you remember ever seeing anybody or hear or see it on TV or whatever stretch their curtains? I remember my Aunt Floy and my Aunt Dell. We never did have those kind of curtains that you stretched. But they had curtain stretchers. And they'd take their curtains down. It didn't seem to me like they were even dirty. But I used to do that too when I was playing at keeping house when I was a young woman and had muslin curtains that I had dyed. And I'd take them down and wash them, starch them, and iron them, and put them back up. I didn't really need it. I sure did. I used to iron underwear too. Oh my goodness, I was very foolish. But anyway, this word that I was going to tell you about is tenterhooks. Do you know what tenterhooks are? You may have heard somebody saying, I was on tenterhooks till I found that out. It came to be known as a period of agitation or worry or whatever. But the original meaning of it was a hook or a nail that you put into a wooden frame to either stretch curtains. In the beginning, it was to hold curtains onto a board above the windows. I expect that's where cornices came from. But anyway, that's what tenterhooks were. They were the brad or the nail that you put through your fabric to hang them like on a shelf. There were, in the end, there were 5 coverings on some of these richly dressed windows, because you always had, if you didn't have cornice boards in particular, you had a cornice over the top of your curtains, which often had tassels on them, or rich fabric of some other kind if you had money. I had cornices made for all my windows one time, a long, long time ago. Most of them are gone now. I still have one in the living room, and I have one in the dining area. All the rest of the cornices have been exchanged for other window treatments. But they were very much in use a long time ago. Anyway, I would hate to think I had to dress my windows with 5 different curtains. But you know what? If you put, back even when I was growing up, the windows weren't airtight like they are now. So if you put up good curtains, it helped you with your heat. You could stay warmer. I've told you before that it was cold in our house, particularly while we still just had the fireplace in the living room for heat. After Daddy put a stove in there, it heated the house a lot better than the fireplace did. Now, let me see. They didn't have hardwood floors. They had softwood. They couldn't afford the hardwood. Most people couldn't. Only the rich. They were stained or varnished. And I know you've seen pictures of women down on their hands and knees. But if you were rich, you had servants to do it. If you were not, you did it yourself. I remember Aunt Elsie telling me her mother-in-law evidently came from money. I don't know, but anyhow, she came to see her when they lived in a coal camp down at Keene Mountain, actually, in Buchanan County. And Aunt Elsie was scrubbing her front porch with a broom and water out of a bucket. And she said, "Why don't you hire somebody to do that for you?" She said, "Surely some of the wives of these miners would be glad to get paid for doing that." And Aunt Elsie said, "Miss Hicks, those miners make more money than your son does. He worked in the office. She said, those miners make more money than your son does. They'd laugh at me if I asked them to come and scrub my floors. And, of course, that was long after the period that I'm talking about. That just came to my mind. I remember scrubbing floors with a broom and porches. I sure do. We didn't have any sidewalks at our house. We had flat stones for walks. I remember sweeping the kitchen yard. I must be really old, you know that? But anyway, back to what I was talking about. Brussels carpets didn't come along for a long time after they used the floor cloths that I was telling you about. Also, many people painted their floors, and if they had carpet, they painted the edges around the carpet. I remember seeing houses like that, too, with just the floors painted around the carpet. And, of course, people had rag rugs, too. Poor people did, that they had knitted or crocheted or whatever. Excuse me. And people use shutters on their windows. That's an inside and out. And according to how much money you had was according to what kind of shutters you had. But about everybody used shutters. On the first floor for privacy, on the second floor to contain the way the sun came into the rooms. Because, you know, if you don't have anything on your windows and the sun comes directly through that glass, it'll sure fade your carpets or your furniture or your bedspreads or your quilts or whatever you have that it can get to. So they use shutters. Now we have tinted glass that you can't tell is tinted. Boy, things are different there, aren't they? It says rural householders use calico, dimity, chintz, and muslin, and simple, inexpensive roller shades. And that's what my mom had on her windows, those roller shades, those white roller shades. And you had to, like, pull them down just a little bit and then let them go up. That's the first thing that I can remember ever on our windows in the way of shades. Now, I was thinking about something I wanted to tell you along those lines, and it's already gone out of my head, but then things don't stay in my head very long. Let's see what else I have written down here. Okay, we've talked about, I used to hear my grandmother, Wagner, say lambiquin. I didn't know what she was saying. I thought she was saying lambiquin. And she was saying lambiquin. And that's a part of a window dressing, like a cornice, only it's made out of a fabric. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I don't ever remember asking her, but I just found out about that word, well, a long time ago now, but when I did this, it brought it back to my mind. That's one of the new words. And then encaustic tile, INCAUSTIC, and that was tile that they put clay in. They colored the clay and put it in those intricate patterns eventually before they fired the tile, and that made it encaustic. I did not know that word when I came across it in the articles I was reading to be able to talk about this. Do any of you have or have you seen a pie safe? Everybody had a pie safe, rich or poor. Everybody had at least one pie safe. My son-in-law built one for his daughter, and Vicky 10 punched it, just like he built a grandfather clock for us, for our family room, and Vicky 10 punched the top of it and put a clock in it. I think Vicky would probably have done okay back in these times. I don't think her mother would have. I'm glad I didn't live in those times. Because I don't think I would have been nearly as ingenious as Vicky would have been. They didn't put salt and pepper shakers on their tables. they had a salt box on the shelf. And they would get salt out and put it in a dish. And you didn't have anything to shake it. You took a pinch of it. If you wanted to season your food, you took a pinch of salt out of the bowl, or I don't know what it was called, where you had gotten the salt out of the salt box on the shelf and put it on the table. And this was done in all kinds of homes. There were dry sinks. Let's see. Windsor chairs for the wealthy. Wood, those cane bottom chairs. My granddad was able to do that. My paternal grandfather, he could fix those chairs, weave those chairs. I don't think there's any left still that he did, but he did them. He could repair them, once they wore out or got broken, that weaving, he could fix it. Of course, he was like most of the people around where we lived. He was poor, and he had to make do with the best he could. The wealthy people had pewter cabinets, and that's their dishes that they ate from pewter. If they had pretty much money, they ate from tin. If they didn't, not a lot of people, unless they were wealthy, had china. They had crockery of some kind, but goodness gracious, they didn't have any mixers, they didn't have any toasters, they didn't have anything that makes life easy for us today. And the people who came before them, like the American Indians, they had less than our pioneers did. Man, things have changed, for sure. And one of the major changes has been the way houses are furnished. And, of course, they had blanket chests. Their lighting was candles and lanterns. I used to read by an oil lamp, but back before petroleum was discovered, they didn't even have that. They had candles and lanterns. That's what they had. And everybody had a spinning wheel. But, the ladies, the ones who had plenty of money, their servants did the spinning. Or they had somebody else do it. They didn't do it themselves. They had on too many bustles, and no, maybe they didn't have bustles, but they had on too many petticoats and layers of clothing. People wore layers of clothing, but they had to keep warm. And then they turned when it got warm, they had to get rid of all of those extra clothes that they'd been carrying around. I have a friend who portrays Mrs. Robert E. Lee in Civil War reenactments. And I always think, when I see what she's putting on, she'll burn up. But she never seems to get the least bit uncomfortable. She always looks cool and calm and collected. There's a picture of her on Facebook today. She's a really pretty lady, and she's a really good Mrs. Robert E. Lee, too. Okay, there was an article in 1868. Now, this is after the Civil War, on how to make oilcloth. So they were still using it after the Civil War. I don't even like to think about the Civil War. I don't like to watch those programs that they bring on where they, about the Civil War. That's something that I would just like to not ever remember. Just like I say, our treatment of the American Indian is a blot on our society, and of course the Civil War is the biggest blot on our country. Other countries have had civil wars, but our Civil War was the worst to me when I study about it, just because it was this country. And it could happen again. Pray the Lord it won't, but it could. but there was a magazine called American Woman's Home Magazine that told you how to make your own oilcloth. Now, the style in 1850, for the people who could afford it, in your bedroom was to have light colors on the walls. They were whitewashed, of course, before paint was discovered, and for the poor people who couldn't afford paint, they were still whitewashed. And then, and often wallpapered, once wallpaper was discovered too. But the style was to have your bedspread or your bed covering, whatever it was, and your curtains match. Now, you didn't do that in your formal living room and your dining room and so on. You didn't have the things to match like that, like your sofa didn't match your curtains and that kind of thing. But in bedrooms, that was the style. At least that's what I read. I'm going to look at the time. I don't want to go over. And I've already gone over. Oh, dear. You know, I have to have somebody call me anymore to remind me of Circle at church that I've been going to for at least 65 years. And I forgot it one month not too long ago. So I asked the ladies, at least 3 of them, to call me to remind me so I wouldn't do that anymore. I felt really bad about it. I teach the Bible. Well, I get taught more than I teach, but I do teach the Bible lesson, and I felt terrible that I forgot it. So this past week, or this past Tuesday, when it was time for Circle, I was at therapy. And when I came home, Jim said, "Mom, 3 people called you about Circle." So they did. They called and reminded me, and I was there like I was supposed to be. That's not a good thing. I'm surely not happy about that, but I'm happy that I have friends who will call and remind me. And we had a good Circle meeting. And I have to go. I'm sorry. And I think that I feel like I've sort of talked off the wall today, but then I was talking about walls. Maybe we'll go into this a little bit more next week and go on into the Victorian period so that we can talk some more about the Sanders house. Until next week, at the same time, at 4 o'clock, if the Lord's willing, we'll be back. I hope until then that you'll be good to each other, that you'll love each other, and remember that as sure as I'm sitting in this chair, I love every one of you. Goodbye.